Just admitting everybody. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning. Great to see you all, some old friends and some new ones. Welcome to our webinar, where we're going to talk about the digital lessons that we all learned as a combined team from the A303 Stonehenge project. Just to let you know, if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. Should we have any technical issues for whatever reason, we will attempt to restart the meeting. So hang on in there. Should we have any drop out or the line go or whatever, then we will make sure that we try and get you all back in. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to all of our partners who are on screen: Angus from Minecraft, Mark from Cool Waters, and Adam from LANet. These are all the partners, or some of the key partners that we work with when we were providing the digital services to the A303 Stonehenge project. We're still working together as part of a small group of partners whose services are all listed on the UK government's G-Cloud framework, but more about that later on. You're going to hear from everybody in the course of this webinar, but before I hand over to one of them, I'm just going to take 1 minute to remind everybody what the A303 Stonehenge scheme was all about. The promoter was National Highways. It was their nationally significant infrastructure project. That's a Technical Planning Act designation, which was designed to replace the highly congested A303 road past the world famous Stonehenge and put all the traffic in a tunnel underneath the protected World Heritage landscape. So that would have removed the sight and the sound of the traffic from the World Heritage Site. After 30 years of going through various iterations to try and get a successful scheme, including the most recent iteration, which itself was 10 years in the designing, the government cancelled the scheme summarily last summer, which was, I think, a shock to everybody. But what that cancellation has meant is that we are now able to talk about the scheme and the work that we did, because while it was ongoing, it was very difficult to talk publicly about what was going on within the project. So just a quick reminder, it was a big project, £2 billion project budget under international scrutiny, most notably by UNESCO. Had it been fully mobilised, it was such a big project, we would have been spending £30 million a day when fully mobilised. That would have seen over 2,000 people working on a hugely complex multi-compound site within a very complex supply chain and operations. And as many of you may know who are familiar with the project, there was also a very well organised opposition. So there was always a risk of physical disruption from protesters. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of what the scheme was. I'm now going to hand over to Angus, who can explain the challenge of the complexity from a digital point of view. Angus, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. One of the key things about a scheme of this sort of size is the amount of organisations that are all working together. It isn't one contractor or one client and doing all the work themselves. There's a whole host of organisations coming together. In fact, this slide here is only in the current phase, but there were previous phases where there were different joint ventures, different sets of organisations. And that brings a lot of challenges in respect to how they work together. Typically, in the past, one of the organisations would have provided a document management system, and they would have used their own email addresses and their own calendars. And when you look at that set of organisations just on that slide alone, I think if we all had a highways, a Costain, or a national trust, or a department for DCMS email address, you can imagine how difficult it would be to even just schedule a meeting. You can't see what's in people's calendars, you can't book rooms. It's a real challenge. The schemes like 303, Low Thames Crossing, A14, others, A66, they are effectively a large organisation, a large temporary organisation. It spins up very quickly. These organisations come together very quickly, have to develop ways of working themselves, and then get on with the job. They don't have an awful lot of time to sit there and contemplate the best way of doing things for digital or anything like that. And typically, digital IT sort of stuff is seen as an overhead and not an enabler, which means that construction is quite immature in the digital space. It used to be slightly ahead of farming, but having spent some time with the Microsoft folks and seeing the technology that's in farming today, I think farmers overtaken it completely. And part of that is because these organisations are working in huge projects, and the investment in the IT and the longevity of it is challenging. What we did on the 303 and on some of the other schemes is work together with some other small medium enterprises to bring skills together, and actually took IT out into the open. And the IT function, the digital function, sat on the leadership team of the project, and excuse me, a bit hoarse. We brought skills to bear that you wouldn't typically have on a project full time. You couldn't really afford them to have enterprise architects or cybersecurity people full time, and we found a way of having that skill set and having that pool of resources so that we could bring IT experience, standards, processes that you wouldn't typically have seen. Some of those, for example, some of you may know, ITIL, you may be familiar with that, is how you manage IT infrastructure, how you manage change to that, the configuration of it. We ran simulations, we ran cybersecurity things to make sure that we're secure, that we can handle incidents, things like that. And we ran health checks on all the systems on a regular basis. And we brought subject matter experts to the table on the project to look at the infrastructure the project was using. We'd set up Office 365, Dynamics, Azure, so there was a common environment for everybody to work in. Now you can see calendars, now you can book meeting rooms, now you can find the documents and share. And we looked at how to get the best out of those platforms. And one of the partners that we brought in was LANet, and their particular area is around Azure and how to manage and control Azure, make sure it's secure and all that sort of stuff. It's not something that a small team on its own can do, and that's the beauty of having SMEs. You can tailor the solutions and find the partners. So I think it's probably a good point for Adam to just talk about LANet and how they helped us on 303.
Yeah, thank you, Angus. So I'm Adam. I work at LANet, and we worked in partnership with Minecraft on the A303 project. So we're Azure experts. It's what we do day in, day out, and that's our specialty. So like Angus said, we were brought in to sort of have a look at the Azure and look after that side of the digital estate for A303. So we first got involved in the project back in 2023. And our job was to make sure that there was the solid foundational Azure platform that needed to be in place to facilitate all of that collaboration and all of that working together on the project, and make sure that that platform was optimized and it met the needs of the project going forward. So it wasn't just a solution for now. It's a solution that could be used for years to come while the project sort of span up and carried out its work. So where did we start with all of that? Well, our first port of call was to carry out a review on the existing environment. So since the project had already been running for a number of years, at the point we got involved, there was already an existing Azure tenancy there. So we inherited quite a lot of existing workloads and sort of legacy systems that were already there that we needed to keep on running. But we also wanted to update that platform and make sure it was best suited for the project at the time. So we carried out that review, looked at all of the workloads that were there, looked at the technologies that were in use and how we could use those, but also update them, bring them into sort of modern best practices, and make sure that the platform was equipped to handle future workloads as well. So following that review, there was a number of areas that we found we could improve upon. A number of things that we could implement and a number of things we could put into the environment to improve it. So at that point, we set about designing a best practice Azure landing zone. So to provide a platform with strong networking, sort of logging, monitoring, strong security focus as well. So to put that platform in and make sure that was there and available to the project. So yeah, once that was in place, we started remediating those existing workloads and pulling all of those into the new structure that we put in place, and making sure that they were still working and that they could still communicate with all the systems they needed to, and that users could still get to them and everything like that. But while having them in that sort of updated new tenancy with all the security in place and all that kind of good stuff, really. So that was the bulk of our work to begin with. And once we'd completed that, we transitioned over to a managed service model. So we were continually going in and tuning the environment and improving it over time, and making sure that we had that good baseline, but we also kept up with best practices and good standards going forward. We didn't just leave that environment and keep it as it was. We were continually improving upon it. A big focus of that was on security, of course, but also optimizing costs and making sure that we could track what was going on in the environment. So part of that was continually deploying updated policies and updated alerts to the environment to make sure that we had that insight into what was going on, and making sure those governance guardrails were in place and up to date. And making sure that the environment stayed as secure as it could be, really. So that was our main involvement with the project. We also sort of assisted Minecraft with any support tickets that came up related to Azure, making sure the environment was running as well as it could do, and sort of facilitating what it needed to, really. So that was our main role on the project.
Lovely, thank you, Adam. That's really good. We really enjoyed working with LANet, and it was invaluable having them on the project looking after Azure. Before we move on to cybersecurity, which is coming in a sec, the world of these projects tends to be Excel everywhere. Everybody's working in Excel. It's quick, it's easy. You can go and build something really quickly. The projects themselves, when they're in flight, the pace is phenomenal. That they're working. They can't afford to be held up. A problem they have today will not be a problem in 6 or 8 weeks or 12 weeks time. Somebody will have gone and solved it, and invariably it will have been through Excel or something similar to that. We brought, because we had the whole environment, the Microsoft environment, 365 Dynamics, Azure, we could actually build applications. And so using sort of high velocity development, we built a number of apps for the project to move away from Excel. One of the big challenges is how do you get the data out into the field? And normally it's on a bit of paper. If you look at what the archaeologists produce, it's covered in mud and it's pretty horrific. It goes into cardboard boxes into the storeroom and you can never get access to it. So we built an app that the archaeology team could use. They had tablets out on site. We built an app to manage the digital assets, the photographs, the videos. We also built an app to do performance manual work. That is how the suppliers interact with the client national highways in terms of how their monthly performance metrics work, which would typically all have been in a beautiful but enormous Excel spreadsheet, which is not really the place you want to be. And that's really a mark of how the challenge is in the sector, that everything has to happen so quickly. You just race for something, you don't necessarily take advantage of the actual platforms that you've got available. We also did some stuff around project portfolio management. We put a tool in there to help allow access to the P6 data, which unless you're a P6 planner doesn't make a lot of sense. So we built an environment in Azure that allowed the project team to access P6. But of course, one of the big areas that is important on 303, as on other projects, but 303's got such a high profile, it did have active protesters, and there were people who were really keen to not have it take place, not get built. And so information security was a real high profile item on our requirements, and we took some time to think about how do we best address this. Do we do something in-house, or how do we demonstrate that we are operating in a secure and reduced risk manner. And to do that, probably a hand over to Mark now to talk about Cool Waters, because Cool Waters came in and guided us through the whole cybersecurity challenge.
Thanks, Angus. Yeah, so cybersecurity for the A33 was quite an interesting project. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk you through some of the things that we learnt along the way, because we did some stuff for the first time on the A303 project, certainly within sort of the UK construction sector and the public sector. So I think there's some useful learnings along the way. So in summary, I'm going to talk about these kind of 4 areas of the 4 lessons that we learned around culture. Angus spoke at the beginning about this complicated joint venture with all these different organizations that bring their own culture, their own rules, their own technology, and how to get all that to gel and work together. We'll talk about supply chain security, which was really the front line of cyber for the A303, and I think for the construction sector in general in the UK. And we'll touch on certification and data classification as well, some real challenges that we had on the project. So let's talk about culture to begin with. You know, cybersecurity is a team sport. It's not something that happens with some nerds in hoodies in the IT department anymore. Everyone has a role to play because everyone uses computers to do their job. Everyone is sending and receiving emails all the time. And we spent some time thinking about how do we build a cyber safe culture in an organization that at the time we joined was maybe 400 people, was going to grow to 2,000. Some of them are very IT literate, some of them are literally people holding, you know, the physical tools, going out working on, you know, doing a real day's work, not sat at a desk all day long. So how do we build a culture of what we were calling cyber safety, not even cybersecurity, cyber safety? That was kind of the phrase that we were trying to develop. And it started with this idea that it's a collective responsibility, it's a team sport, and everyone has a role to play. And that turned up in the way that people joined the project. There was an onboarding process for everyone who joined the project to learn how to use the infrastructure in the headquarters building or the Microsoft hubs and the room bookings, all that kind of good stuff. And we had cybersecurity there as part of that induction from day one. So as people walked through the door and joined the project, they understood that actually cyber safety is really important for this project. And we talked about some of the risks and the unique elements that were driving that. So we really understood the why and the wherefore. And one of the things that we wanted to do was for people to be really aware and to report smoke, not fire. So to report things that look risky rather than wait for there to be a problem and report that, you know, it's all gone horribly wrong. If you think about the journey the construction industry in particular has gone on over the last, say, 20 years. 20 years ago, health and safety went from being something that the annoying bloke in the high-vis jacket in the corner of the office did to something that was embedded in the way that people worked. Yeah, that kind of the see something, say something culture, driving down, you know, physical injuries and really promoting health and safety across the construction sector. And that went from being an initiative that they had to work hard at 20 years ago to today. It's, you know, it's taken as read that this is something that's taken seriously, and you get your, you know, kind of safety moments in most meetings, toolbox talks at the start of every day to keep people safe. 10 years ago, that developed further, and we went from worrying about physical safety only to worrying about mental safety as well, recognizing that actually people's mental state affects the way that they physically operate, especially in somewhere like a construction site where people are using tools, heavy machinery. If people aren't focused on what they're doing, the risks of injury to themselves or someone else, or a mistake being made that costs the project lots of pounds or hours, is magnified. And so we had this kind of progression. 20 years ago, it's all about physical safety. 10 years ago, we recognized that mental safety was part of that. We had this whole push around looking after people's mental health and making it acceptable to talk about these things and kind of drive it forwards. And what we were doing on the A303 was really kind of pushing the definition of safety beyond physical and mental and talking about cyber safety as well. And so we were getting into a position where we had this integrated approach to safety, whether it's physical, mental, or cyber, and it's all just safety. So when you have the safety moment at the start of a meeting, you could talk about any one of those 3 topics. When we have the developing the instant reporting app for all the people out on site, you can report a safety incident, whether it was physical safety, mental safety, or cyber safety, and really kind of driving this idea that safety is safety, whether it's in the physical world, in the cyber world, or in what's going on inside people's heads. And I think that was kind of something that was quite pioneering that we were doing on this particular project, and we're certainly in Cool Waters going to be working to continue to drive that as a concept through the work that we do in the construction industry and the industry in general. And the last thing we had to do was to make sure that people understood what the rules were. Remember, we've got this collective of people who've come from different organizations that will have their own rules that they were used to working under, their own certifications they were used to working under. And then when they come to the A303, actually now they need to work in the way that the A303 works. And we were pioneering. The A303 project was the first national highways major project to be certified for ISO 27001, the first to be certified for Cyber Essentials Plus. So this was a new way of working for people, not just in IT, but all the way through from procurement through to operations. And so we had to make sure that people understood what was going on. So driving that education from the top level, from the strategic board through to operational management, and this ongoing educational program that we had that had content going up on the digital screens. That was something that we were talking about in the monthly newsletters, in the weekly all hands. All this was how we were working to develop this culture of cyber awareness and cyber safety in this, as Angus was saying, very fast-paced, technology-driven, critical national infrastructure project. So let's talk about supply chain security for a second. So this is something that's key in many industries, especially in construction. And we often talk about PII in the world of cybersecurity, but in the context of what we were doing, PII didn't stand for personally identifiable information because there really wasn't any in the context of the A303, but we had procurement in ignorance going on. What I mean by that is in a very long running project, I mean, some of the things that we were working on, these are people who've been working on this project for maybe 10 years historically. And so we've got long standing contracts that are in place, supplier frameworks that have been designed and contracted, for many years. And what we were discovering is that those contracts didn't account for some of the requirements that we had for cybersecurity, supply chain management, the requirements of the ISO 27001 framework, for example. So even though there was a contractual requirement that go right from the top from National Highways that was supposed to trickle down all the way through the supply chain, that we'll be applying the ISO 27001 standards for supply chain management, we were discovering that there were many contracts already signed and running where those requirements hadn't been written in. And so we're having to go on an evangelistic program to try and persuade people, because the ink was dry on these contracts, to put some stuff in place that should have been built into the original procurement but had been missed out. So from a lessons learned perspective, we need to make sure that when we think about cyber safety and certification compliance, that needs to be educated in to the commercial and procurement teams right at the start, so we can make sure all the contracts that get signed that then trickle down through the whole supply chain have all these clauses and requirements built into them right from the beginning. It's quite hard to fit them in afterwards. When it comes to signing up to new suppliers, as we're getting ready to build out the project, we came up with this framework to understand who were the risky suppliers. How does supply chain due diligence work in this context? And how do we decide what's the level of certification, for example, that people want? So thinking about cyber risk. And we came up with this framework that looked at 2 lenses. One, what's the pound value of the contract? We can use that as a proxy for understanding how important is that supplier. We'll be spending more money with people that are more important. Therefore, we should probably expect a higher level of due diligence, a higher level of cyber assurance from those bigger contracts. But what we also learned is that although that's a good guide, it's not a perfect guide, because there are some relatively low value financial contracts in place that, if they went wrong, could have a very big impact on operations. And one example that was given to me was the small company with 2 employees and 2 vans that put out the cones on the roads, and they have to kind of manage and adjust the way the contraflows work once construction starts. And if those guys don't turn up on time or do their job properly, then that has a big impact on the road network. And so actually they become a very financially low value but very high risk supplier from a cyber perspective, because if their computers don't work and they don't know where they're supposed to be and they can't read the map that tells them where the cones are supposed to go, suddenly things get complicated really quickly on a busy road. So we had this framework that basically said, if someone's at low risk, we want to see them Cyber Essentials certified. If they're high risk, which means high value or high risk to operations, potentially we want to get them all the way up to ISO 27001 certification, so that we can trust that as part of the supply chain, they're going to be there every day doing the work that they need to do, so the whole project can deliver. And the tier 1 contractors that were part of the scheme generally were all ISO 27001 certified, not all of them, but most of them already were. But it's how do we trickle that down the supply chain, because the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? So how do we kind of get that all the way, trickled all the way down? One of the things that I learned as part of this project that was actually the highest risk supplier in the whole supply chain was the fleet of lorries that will be turning up with concrete every single day. If you're not familiar with the A303 scheme, there's going to be a massive tunnel boring machine that was going to be digging the tunnels for the new route for the road, and following on as the machine was digging under the ground, it would be putting the concrete walls up behind it as it went. So there had to be this never-ending fleet of lorries. The machine is running 24/7, 365 days a year. The concrete has to keep on flowing, and any pause in the delivery of the concrete brought all operations to a stop in terms of digging the tunnel. That's the most expensive thing that could possibly go wrong. And there aren't that many concrete lorries in the south of England. So actually what we have is a whole network of lots of different suppliers, all working in a complicated schedule, bringing the concrete of the right standard, the right consistency every day at the right time. And if any one of those or group of those suffered a ransomware attack and their computers stop working, then they don't know where the lorries are supposed to be going and they don't deliver the concrete on time. So actually we discovered that Bob Smith's concrete supply company with its 2 little mixers is a very high risk supplier to the A303 project. So we need to worry about them being, for example, Cyber Essentials certified, so we can be confident that their computers work and they know where they're supposed to be on any given day. Now, this might all seem a little bit theoretical, but the reality of it really did come home to us just before Christmas. That the cancellation of the scheme had already been announced. We were starting to go into kind of wind down and safe handover mode. But the 3rd largest supplier to the whole to the scheme was completely wiped out by ransomware just before Christmas. And so we did see that the reality of the risk there. And had we been not in cancellation mode, but really mobilizing up, that would have been a massive impact to the project, and the costs would have gone into telephone numbers, numbers of pounds. So it would have been very, very significant. So we saw the reality of the risk to projects like the A303. If one key supplier gets taken out, it has a massive impact. So supply chain security is, I think, the front line for major projects and construction in general. Just kind of rounding off now, just talk about certification for a second. I said that we were the first project to have ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials Plus from a critical national infrastructure, national highways perspective. And when you're a joint venture, that's quite a challenge, because there is no A303 limited. And most certifications like ISO or Cyber Essentials, you certify a legal entity. you certify someone that exists on the register at company's house. And in the case of this scheme, that actually didn't exist. So what we had to do was spend some time with the compliance people at UCAS, working out how was a way we can manage this. Where would the certification live? And at the end of the day, the scheme that we came up with, that they signed up on, was actually the certifications would live with Minecraft, because Minecraft was leading all of the digital work for the A303. We had these wonderfully complicated scope statements for the certifications that said the certification is for Minecraft working on behalf of National Highways to deliver the A303 Stonehenge bypass project. And so that was kind of how we worked around that particular challenge. And any joint venture will have the same kind of issue. You can't certify a project, you can only certify a legal entity. So it's worth thinking that through when you're doing that initial procurement phase. Remember, we talked about procurement in ignorance. So you need to understand what the limitations are around some of the things you're asking people to do from a certification perspective, and make sure the right legal entities exist, or you understand what the framework is, so you can get the certificates issued that you want. As someone has mentioned, this scheme has been in existence for many years. I mean, some iterations go back maybe 20 years. So there's a whole raft of paper and emails and documents that exist. And certainly when at the point we were starting to wind down the scheme, we did a quick count, and there was something like 1.25 million emails and documents that existed in the Microsoft tenant alone, let alone anywhere else. And one of the things the scheme had never quite managed to wrap its head around was data classification and retention. If you're familiar with Microsoft 365, you know that it has all those tools built in, but you've got to apply those settings to each document or to each SharePoint site, and that was never done. It was always one of those things that we're trying to get around to. The longer you leave it, the bigger the backlog goes of documents that need to be certified. And when you get an unexpected cancellation, suddenly it brings all this into focus when we were trying to work out, well, which of these 1.2 million emails and documents do we need to hand back over to National Highways for them to look after in the future. So from a lessons learned perspective, get this stuff sorted from day one of any project, because it's much harder to retrofit it the longer that you leave it. And just the last two things that I learned personally on this project that I was never warned about. I was never warned about the dead bodies or the human remains, and I was never warned about King Arthur. So just to put this into context. So the area where the scheme was operating, people have been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. So as soon as you start digging into that soil, there's a very high probability that you discover some interesting archaeology and potentially even some human remains. And I've never been part of a project before where the daily briefing starts with, oh, and we found a dead body this morning. And that happened more than once on the A303 project. And when you're not expecting it, it kind of takes you back a bit. And the next comment is, but it's okay. So it was over 100 years old, so we didn't need to phone the police. The archaeologists have a protocol to take care of this. But it was kind of unexpected. Also, because of where the scheme was taking place, it's in and around the area of Stonehenge. So one of the stakeholder groups that was involved was the English Druid community. And by tradition, their leader is known as King Arthur Pendragon. And so in the stakeholder meetings and the protester intelligence meetings, we talk about who are the people that are the key stakeholders of the project. And as the leader of the Druid community, King Arthur Pendragon was one of those. So again, it's a little bit surreal to be sitting in a meeting where someone turns and says, and what does King Arthur think about this? But I guess it's something that you get used to. And lastly, the risk of physical protest was quite high. As we said earlier, this was a controversial scheme. Some people had some reservations about the way that it was being implemented. And if you think about how the world has changed, 5 years ago, even if you wanted to stop some construction work going on, all you had to do was go and lie down in front of the bulldozer, and that was all that was necessary. And Mrs. Miggins could go and do that herself quite happily. But in a world that is increasingly interconnected, where we have a high level of IT devices, IoT devices as part of a construction site. So, for example, to get in and out of the compound, there would be swipe cards, so we could track where everybody was at any given time. There would be rainwater sensors that are detecting the level of moisture in the ground, so the tunnel boring machine could operate correctly. If you could hack one of those, for example, make the tunnel boring machine think that there's a flood, so it shuts down, take the access gates offline at the compound, so the 500 blokes that have just turned up in their boots ready to do a day's work just can't physically get in anymore, then you could bring the operations to a stop without ever having to lie down in the mud. And maybe Mrs. Miggins doesn't have the skills to do that herself, but she probably has the £500, which is all that it will cost to pay Ivan sat in his mum's basement in Moscow in his pants, looking for work as a contractor for a hacker for hire. And so suddenly the capabilities of the average person who wants to cause mischief and disruption is very much lower now than it ever used to be. And the rise of ransomware as a service and hackers for hire on the dark web, anyone with 500 quid can cause a lot of disruption if they want to. So that really much informed the way that we were thinking about cybersecurity and making sure we're driving all the way through our supply chain, so that disruption could not happen and take the scheme offline and waste a lot of taxpayers' money as a result. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand back to Angus.
Thanks, Mark. Some great anecdotes there. Yes, it was a real experience putting the scheme through accreditation. That was a bit of a head scratch at the time. How do we do this? But it got a lot of respect within the National Highways IT team. We worked very closely with the CISO in Highways, and we used their SOC and things like that. So there was a lot of good interaction with the client. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of other areas just to talk about where we've learned some lessons. One's around sort of adoption and innovation. Our team was embedded within the project, even during the COVID period, when offices were open again. The team were in there from the beginning to try and provide that core capability so that people can interact with them, can see them, can come and learn at lunches. The Microsoft platform is so rich, and the default of using Excel so strong that actually we really had to push hard to show the capabilities of the platform, the tools that were available, be on hand to say, well, actually there might be a better way we could do this for you, or we can do some training for people ad hoc. We did inductions for IT when people joined and things like that. So we really pushed hard. Folks working on these projects are very driven. They've got clear goals in mind. And actually, I'll just send it in an email. Well, actually, then nobody can see it. And so why don't we use Teams? Why don't we put it in channels? Why don't we put the documents in Teams so everybody can collaborate on them and share them? So that message was pushed continuously. We used a partner called CPS, who helped us enormously on that. As Mark said, the data retention thing, we never fully implemented the capabilities of the platform because it was a continuous moving target. And in order to do really good data retention, you need to understand what your data is. And we've got hundreds of people with hundreds of different sets of data, and trying to bring that into one was a real challenge. And there was a lot of historical data. The project has been going over 3 iterations, over 30 years. But we did also get to do some really cool innovation stuff, as well as the sort of day-to-day keeping it secure and the lights on. And it's worth just touching on some of those things. They made quite an impression, some of the stuff we were able to do. We have a really good relationship with the folks in Microsoft who work around Central Gov and the Highways team. And they provided a huge amount of support and help, bringing partners to us if we needed a particular skill set. One of the things, you can actually go and see this on YouTube, it's not for the 303, but it was for the A428, was to actually build the whole scheme in Minecraft. And the reason to do that was the challenge is, how do you bring a new demographic to the consultation process? You're going to get a load of middle-aged retired road engineers come along, but not many other people. So we actually targeted, how do we get kids and parents involved? And the whole scheme was built. You can watch the fly through on YouTube, 4 to 8 Minecraft, and Mumsnet got involved, and there was a real positive response to that. So that was taking IT from a completely different direction, saying how can we tackle that particular challenge. We also built the archaeology app, which you can see on a tablet there, was taken out in the field, and the archaeologists were really pleased with that. And that only got to the early stages of that because, unfortunately, the scheme got stood down before the full archaeology kicked off. And the thing on the right, we built a proof of concept with a partner called Edgis, who specialize in augmented reality. And what we have there is 2 screenshots of a mobile phone where you are looking at the landscape and overlying data from the scheme on there. The green one is looking at a long barrow, so you can see exactly where it is. And the red one, for anybody who's not familiar how these schemes work, when they get consent, legal consent, they have a boundary. It's called the red line boundary. And quite often you can be talking to a landowner or somebody in construction out there, and there's no physical red line. And so all the paper comes out and the chat's up, well, do I go through your garden here or do I not go through your garden? The red line boundary was overlaid onto this app, so you could walk out with your mobile phone, you could see exactly where it was. And if you walked through it, the landscape turned red. So now you know you've stepped outside the boundary. And that boundary is where National Highways and the JV have their legal powers to do the construction, things like that. We did a proof of concept on the A14 as well, which was, again, with another Microsoft partner, Microsoft involved, around how do you look at all the data from the project and around, and can you try to predict, is today a high risk or a low risk day for health and safety? And some of the things that were fed into that were things like sports fixtures, weather, the shift, the number of supervisors on site. A whole host of data was fed in there. And one of the challenges is, well, what do you do with that? And so it was distilled down to something really simple. Today is a high risk day, or today isn't. You're not trying to say to people, oh, go away and relax, there's no guarantee that you're not going to have an accident. What you're trying to do is say, we haven't got many supervisors. You were all watching the World Cup last night. Probably need to be more vigilant because people might be tired. People might not turn up for shift. That sort of thing. We had the opportunity to set up the project office. One of our partners is actually on this call. Vasco, hi Vasco. Aura did an absolute cracking job, helped us enormously set out the office to make it as easy to work in as possible. So do I need a badge to do this? No, actually you can walk in, it's facial recognition, get into the building easily. So if you've forgotten your badge, you don't have to drive home, you can just get in. I'm really proud to say we were the first customer in the UK to take the Surface Hub 3. We put those throughout the office. They were absolutely fantastic for allowing people to collaborate, because we've still got hybrid working. Not everybody's in every day, so that really enabled us to make the best out of that technology. And the final thing to mention is the virtual reality. The 303 had an enormous task of conveying to the public, to stakeholders, to people like the World Heritage Committee, what the scheme was actually going to do to that landscape. And you can paint pictures, you can take photographs and fiddle around with them, but actually, if you want to experience it, VR, and the state of VR at the moment is you can create a really good view of how the landscape will change. And the 303 and a partner called MXT built a simulation based on all the real data, the real tree data, the real landscape data, and you could see what it looks like now and what it will look like when it's finished, or would have looked like when it's finished. And that was really helpful in communicating to key stakeholders about the impact, the positive impact that the scheme was going to have on the landscape. So I think that's enough of me chattering on. Sarah, if I can hand back to you.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Adam. So you can see a whole bunch of new experiences that the digital team had on the scheme, and a whole bunch of lessons. It's very hard to summarize all the learnings in just one webinar. Almost each of those innovations on its own could almost warrant a webinar, a standalone webinar. But I think in terms of the key lessons that we all learned as a group of SMEs is that we can work really well together in a complex environment, which is quite often dominated by much, much larger suppliers. We learned the criticality of having that single working environment in Microsoft 365, so everybody can use the same systems and have access to the same data. Implementing standards and process from the IT while giving real robust structure and a framework to put digital behaviour at the heart of the project. That was critical. You've heard from Mark how important cybersecurity was. And, you know, some of the challenges as well, what we could have done better had we had more time, perhaps, you know, around data retention as well. And I think the fact that the digital team, the combined team, were at the heart of the project meant that, and because of the scale of the project, there was that ability and willingness to innovate and to do things differently from how they'd all been done before. And I think for me, the biggest lesson was that it's not simply about the tin, as Angus occasionally calls it, the technology, it's about culture. And I think you heard Mark talk there about the importance of culture in driving home that cybersecurity. And you heard Adam mention how important it was to actually get a robust framework and platform in place and to make sure everybody knew how to use it. So a summary of some of the lessons. We could probably take more time and, as I said, do more shorter webinars on some of those individual areas. We, as I said earlier at the beginning, we are still working together. All our services are available through the government's G-Cloud framework. As you can see, we cover everything, specialising in project and programme management right from the beginning, from business case to benefits, including a platform called Sensei IQ, which manages complex programs and portfolios in a very different way, which is aligned to the Microsoft work management tools. Cybersecurity in its many guises, from full service protection to accreditation and procurement of ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials, offered by Cool Waters. The full Azure cloud planning and strategy services offered by LA-Net. One of the services which indeed we provide for highways was the Security Operations Centre, almost like having your own virtual CTO, a great idea for smaller companies who don't necessarily have a department that's dedicated to that. And then in broader terms, you know, we as a group of partners are able to offer that full digital transformation support and digital advisory support. So if anyone, either public sector or private sector, has got any questions about any of those areas, we'd be more than happy to have a chat with you to explain in more detail. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. We're very happy to pick up offline. If you've got any questions of any of the partners individually, please do drop us a line. You have all our contact details there, email, telephone number, and the web links to the individual partners' websites. So if there are no questions, and I see no hands up, we will leave it there, thanking you for your time and your attention, and look out for more webinars from Mindcraft and partners as we move forward. Thank you very much to everybody. Have a great day.